The diplomatic transport vessel Aurora's Dream shook violently as it fell through the thick atmosphere of Kepler 442b. Metal screamed against metal, and sparks flew from broken control panels. Jake Martinez gripped his seat with white knuckles as the ship spun out of control. The other passengers around him were not human. They came from different worlds across the galaxy, but right now they all looked the same. They looked scared. Commander Veltar, a tall reptilian being with green scales, tried to reach the emergency controls. His people were known throughout the galaxy as master tacticians. They could plan battles that lasted for years. But planning meant nothing when your ship was falling like a rock toward an alien world. Dr. Keshrin clicked and buzzed in her native language. She was an insectoid creature with 4 arms and compound eyes that saw in spectrums humans could not imagine. Her species had built technology that could bend space and time. But all that knowledge could not stop a crashing ship. Thane Morgoth was twice the size of Jake and covered in thick brown fur. His people were warriors who could tear through steel with their bare hands. He sat perfectly still as the ship fell, showing no fear. But even his incredible strength would not help him now. Ambassador Yilseen floated near the ceiling, her energy form flickering like a dying light bulb. Her people were beings of pure energy who could live for thousands of years. They understood the secrets of the universe that other species could only dream about. But understanding the universe did not make you immune to gravity. Jake was just a structural engineer from Texas. He built bridges and buildings back on Earth. Compared to these beings, he was nothing special. His people had only been traveling between stars for a few decades. The other species had been doing it for centuries or millennia. The ship hit the ground with a sound like thunder. Jake felt himself thrown forward against his restraints. His head rang like a bell, and he tasted blood in his mouth. For a moment, everything was quiet except for the sound of settling metal and distant electrical fires. Jake unbuckled himself and stood up slowly. His left shoulder ached, but nothing seemed broken. Around him, the other survivors were picking themselves up. The ship's hull had cracked open like an egg. Through the gaps, Jake could see gray sky and rocky ground. Commander Veltar stood up and brushed debris off his uniform. "Status report," he commanded, even though there was no one left to give him one. The ship's computer was dead. The communication systems were destroyed. Even the emergency beacon was nothing but twisted metal and burnt circuits. Dr. Keshrin examined the wreckage with her multiple eyes. "The probability of rescue is extremely low," she announced in her translated voice. "Our position is unknown." The ship's distress signal was not sent before impact. Thane Morgoth pushed aside a fallen beam that would have taken 3 humans to move. "We are warriors," he said in his deep voice. "We do not need rescue. We will survive until help comes." Ambassador Yilseen drifted toward the largest crack in the hull. Her energy form was dimmer than before. "The atmospheric readings are acceptable for most of our species," she said, "but this world is hostile. The weather patterns are severe." Jake walked to the opening and looked outside. The landscape was harsh and empty. Jagged rocks jutted up from the ground like broken teeth. The plants that grew between them looked tough and fibrous, adapted to survive in difficult conditions. In the distance, dark clouds were building on the horizon. "How long until those clouds reach us?" Jake asked. Dr. Keshrin consulted a small scanner that had somehow survived the crash. "Approximately 18 hours. The storm system appears to be massive." Jake examined the wreckage around them. The ship's hull was cracked in dozens of places. When the storm hit, they would be soaked within minutes. The metal walls that remained standing would not provide much shelter from wind and rain. He walked outside and began looking at the materials available to them. There were pieces of metal from the ship, ranging from small strips to large panels. The alien plants were interesting. Their fibers looked strong, and some of them seemed to repel water naturally. The rocks were mostly a dark stone that looked dense and hard. "What are you doing, human?" Commander Veltar asked. He had followed Jake outside. "Looking at what we have to work with," Jake replied, picking up a strip of metal and testing its flexibility. "We should remain with the ship," the commander said. "It provides the best available shelter." Jake looked at the cracked hull and shook his head. "This won't keep us dry when that storm hits. Look at all these gaps. The wind will go right through it." Dr. Keshrin joined them outside. "The human is correct. The structural integrity of the vessel is compromised. It will not provide adequate protection from severe weather." "Then what do you suggest?" Thane Morgoth asked. He had also come outside, ducking through the opening because of his size. Jake picked up one of the fibrous plants and examined it closely. "We build something better." The aliens looked at him like he had said something crazy. Ambassador Yilsine floated closer, her form flickering with what might have been amusement. "Human Jake," she said, "we have no tools, no advanced materials, no construction equipment. How do you propose to build anything in this primitive environment?" Jake smiled and started pulling more plants from the ground. "The same way humans have been building things for thousands of years, with whatever we can find and a lot of hard work." Commander Veltar crossed his arms. "Your species is known for optimism, but this seems foolish. We should conserve our energy and wait for rescue." "Maybe," Jake said, testing the strength of the plant fibers by pulling on them. "But where I come from, we don't just sit around waiting for someone else to save us. We save ourselves." The storm clouds were getting bigger and darker. Jake estimated they had less than a day before the weather hit. That meant less than a day to build something that could keep 5 beings alive in conditions that none of them had ever faced before. But Jake had been building things his whole life. And he had never built anything more important than what he was about to build now. Jake had been working for 16 hours when the first drops of rain began to fall. His hands were cut and bleeding from handling the sharp metal pieces, but he kept working. Around him, piles of materials grew larger. Strips of metal were sorted by size and thickness. Plant fibers were bundled and ready for weaving. Rocks were stacked according to their shape and weight. The aliens watched him from inside the broken ship. They huddled together as the wind began to pick up. Commander Veltar paced back and forth like a caged animal. His tactical mind was used to solving problems with strategy and planning. But there was no strategy for surviving the storm with no proper shelter. Dr. Keshrin had calculated their chances of survival multiple times. Each calculation came back with the same result. Without adequate shelter, they would not survive the storm system that was approaching. Her 4 arms moved nervously as she checked and rechecked her scanner readings. Thane Morgoth sat perfectly still, but his eyes followed Jake's every movement. The massive warrior had seen many battles, but this was different. In battle, you could fight your enemy. You could use your strength and courage to win, but you could not fight the weather. You could not punch rain or wrestle with wind. Ambassador Yilsine floated near a crack in the hull, watching the storm clouds grow bigger. Her energy form was getting dimmer as time passed. The crash had damaged something inside her, and she was slowly losing power. She would need shelter more than any of them. Jake worked outside in the growing wind and rain. He had found a spot between 2 large rock formations that formed a natural windbreak. The rocks were about 20 feet apart and rose about 8 feet high. It was not perfect, but it would help block some of the wind. "Human, you must come inside." Commander Veltar called out. "The storm is beginning. Your work can wait." Jake looked up from where he was digging a shallow trench. Raindrops hit his face and ran down into his collar. "Can't wait," he called back. "Once this really starts, I won't be able to work outside at all." Dr. Keshrin clicked anxiously. "The atmospheric pressure is dropping rapidly. Wind speeds will reach dangerous levels within 2 hours." Jake nodded but kept working. He was digging the trench to help channel water away from his chosen building spot. Back home in Texas, he had learned about flash floods and water management the hard way. When he was 12, his family's house had flooded because water had nowhere to go. He was not going to make that mistake again. The rain was falling harder. Now Jake's clothes were soaked through, but he continued sorting materials. He had discovered that some of the plant fibers became more flexible when they were wet. Others became stiffer. He needed to understand how each material behaved before he could use it properly. Thane Morgoth finally stood up and walked to the opening in the ship's hull. "Small human," he called out. "You will die of cold if you continue this madness. Come inside where it is dry." Jake looked back at the ship. Water was already dripping through dozens of cracks. The interior was hardly dry, and it would only get worse as the storm intensified. "Thanks, but I'm fine out here," he replied. The wind was getting stronger by the minute. Jake could feel it pushing against him as he worked. He started laying out the first pieces of his frame. The metal strips from the ship were surprisingly strong when he bent them into curves. He connected them together using twisted plant fibers that he had braided into rope. Ambassador Yilsine drifted closer to the opening. "Jake Martinez of Earth," she said, her translated voice barely audible over the wind. "Your determination is admirable, but this effort is futile. The materials are insufficient. The conditions are impossible." Jake was wrestling with a particularly stubborn piece of metal, trying to bend it into the right shape. "Maybe," he grunted as he applied pressure. "But impossible just means nobody's figured out how to do it yet." Dr. Keshrin ran another calculation on her scanner. The probability of successfully constructing adequate shelter with these materials is less than 3%. "What about the probability if we don't try at all?" Jake asked, not looking up from his work. There was silence from inside the ship. Jake knew the answer to that question. Without shelter, their chances were zero. The storm was getting serious now. Rain fell in sheets that made it hard to see more than a few feet in any direction. The wind howled between the rocks and rattled the broken pieces of the ship. Hail began to fall, small at first but growing larger. Jake pulled a piece of metal paneling over his head to protect himself from the hail. He had managed to get the basic frame of his shelter in place. It was a dome shape that would help shed wind and rain. But there was still so much work to do. Commander Veltar appeared at the ship's opening, getting soaked as he stepped outside. "Human, this is insanity. You cannot build a shelter in the middle of a storm." Jake was weaving plant fibers between the metal frame pieces. His fingers were numb with cold, but he kept working. "My grandfather built houses during the Great Depression," he said. "He told me that you don't wait for good conditions to do what needs doing. You do it when it needs doing." The commander stared at him for a moment, then shook his head and went back inside. The hail was getting bigger. Some pieces were as large as golf balls, and they hit with enough force to hurt. Jake worked under whatever cover he could find, moving from spot to spot as he continued building. The plant fibers were proving to be better than he had hoped. When woven together tightly, they created a surprisingly strong and flexible material. Inside the ship, the aliens were discovering that their shelter was not as good as they had thought. Water poured through the cracks in increasing amounts. The wind found every gap and created howling drafts that made it impossible to stay warm. Electrical systems that had survived the crash were now failing due to water damage. Dr. Kesherin scanner finally gave up completely, its circuits fried by moisture. "We are losing all our technological advantages." She buzzed nervously. Thane Morgoth used his strength to try to block some of the larger gaps with debris, but there were too many holes and not enough material. "This shelter is failing," he admitted. Outside, Jake continued working through the storm. He was completely soaked and shivering with cold, but his shelter was taking shape. The dome structure was holding up well against the wind. The woven plant fiber walls were keeping most of the rain out. He had even managed to create a simple door using a piece of flexible metal that could be sealed shut. As the storm reached its full fury, Jake finally finished the basic structure. It was small and crude looking, but it was solid. He had built it using principles he had learned in engineering school and techniques his grandfather had taught him. Most importantly, he had built it to work. Jake squeezed inside his shelter and sealed the door. For the first time in hours, he was out of the wind and rain. The inside was dry and surprisingly warm. His body heat was trapped by the woven walls, and the dome shape helped circulate the air. Outside, the storm raged with incredible fury, but inside his small shelter, Jake was safe and dry. He listened to the wind howling around the dome and smiled. It was not the Ritz-Carlton, but it was home. Jake woke up dry and warm inside his small shelter. Outside, the storm was still raging, but the dome held strong against the wind and rain. He could hear water running away from his shelter through the drainage channels he had dug. The design was working exactly as he had planned. He crawled outside into the storm to check on the aliens. The broken ship looked even worse than before. Water was pouring through dozens of new cracks. The hull was starting to buckle under the pressure of the wind. Inside, he could see the aliens huddled together in the only dry corner that remained. "How did you survive the night?" Commander Veltar asked when Jake appeared at the opening. The reptilian scales were dull and wet. His usual confident posture was gone. "My shelter works," Jake said simply. "You should come see it." Dr. Keshrin looked up from where she was trying to keep her remaining equipment dry. "Impossible. Our calculations showed that the materials could not provide adequate protection." "Calculations don't mean much if you're calculating wrong," Jake replied. "Come look for yourselves." The aliens followed Jake through the storm to his shelter. They had to duck down to fit through the small entrance, but once inside they stopped and stared. The interior was completely dry. The woven walls moved slightly in the wind but did not leak. Air circulated freely, preventing the buildup of moisture. That would cause problems. Then Morgoth ran one massive hand along the curved wall. "This should not be possible," he said in his deep voice. "These materials are primitive. They should not provide such protection." Jake was already working on improvements to his design. He had noticed a few small leaks during the night and was fixing them with additional plant fiber. "The materials aren't primitive," he said as he worked. "You just have to understand how to use them." Ambassador Yilsine floated near the ceiling of the dome, her energy form brighter now that she was out of the wind and rain. "Explain how this structure functions," she requested. Jake pointed to different parts of his shelter as he talked. "The dome shape spreads the wind load evenly. No single point takes too much stress. The curved walls make the wind go around instead of hitting straight on. That reduces the pressure." He showed them how he had woven the plant fibers. "These fibers expand when they get wet. That makes the weave tighter and keeps more water out. I learned that by testing them yesterday." Dr. Keshrin examined the weaving pattern with her compound eyes. "The mathematical precision is remarkable for work done without instruments." "I don't need instruments," Jake said. "My eyes can see if something is straight or crooked. My hands can feel if something is tight or loose. Sometimes simple tools are better than complicated ones." Commander Veltar studied the frame structure. The metal strips are arranged in a geodesic pattern. This distributes stress more efficiently than our military shelter designs. Jake nodded. "Back on Earth, we've been building domes like this for decades. The shape is naturally strong. Even if one part gets damaged, the rest of the structure can still hold up." He showed them the drainage system he had built around the shelter. Channels cut into the ground carried water away from the foundation. The shelter itself was raised slightly on small stone supports to keep the floor dry. Water always goes downhill, Jake explained. You just have to give it somewhere to go that isn't where you want to be. Thane Morgoth was impressed despite himself. You built this entire structure in less than 2 days, in the middle of a storm, with no assistance. Had to, Jake said, checking another potential leak spot. Waiting for better conditions wasn't an option. The aliens spent the rest of the morning examining Jake's shelter and asking questions. They were beginning to understand that human engineering was different from their own approaches, where their species relied on advanced materials and precise calculations. Humans learned to work with whatever was available. Your people do not give up easily, Ambassador Yilseen observed. Jake was reinforcing a stress point in the frame with extra plant fiber rope. We can't afford to give up. Earth is a tough planet. Hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, droughts. If you give up every time things get difficult, you don't survive long. Dr. Keshrin clicked thoughtfully. Our worlds were more stable when our species evolved. We developed technology to overcome challenges rather than adapting to them directly. Both ways work, Jake said. But when your technology fails, you need something to fall back on. Commander Veltar looked back toward their failing ship shelter. Our vessel provided adequate protection initially, but we did not adapt when conditions changed. That's the difference, Jake agreed. I built this shelter to get better as the storm got worse. The wind actually helps hold it down now. The kundo. Rain makes the walls tighter. Instead of fighting the storm, I made the shelter work with it. As if to prove his point, a strong gust of wind hit the shelter. Instead of shaking or creaking, the dome simply flexed slightly and held firm. The drainage channels carried away the extra rainwater without any flooding. Thane Morgoth stood up, his head nearly touching the ceiling. Human Jake, I misjudged your capabilities. This shelter is superior to our original refuge. Jake was working on his next improvement. He had noticed that the entrance could be better sealed and was braiding additional plant fibers into a more effective door cover. It's not about being superior, he said. It's about not accepting failure as an option. The storm outside was getting worse. Weather patterns on this planet were more violent than anything the aliens had experienced on their home worlds. But inside Jake's shelter, they were safe and comfortable. Dr. Keshrin ran calculations in her head since her scanner was ruined. By my estimates, this structure could withstand conditions significantly more severe than what we are currently experiencing. Good, Jake said, because according to what I saw yesterday, this storm is just getting started. Ambassador Yilseen flickered with what might have been concern. There will be more severe weather? Jake nodded as he worked. The cloud patterns I observed suggested this storm system is much larger than what we've seen so far. We're probably going to be here for a while. The aliens looked at each other with expressions ranging from worry to resignation. They had expected rescue within days. The idea of surviving for weeks in this harsh environment had not occurred to them. But Jake just kept working on improvements to his shelter. He had learned something important about humans during this crisis. They were not the strongest species in the galaxy. They were not the smartest or the most technologically advanced. But they had something that the other species seemed to lack. They had the ability to keep going when everything seemed hopeless. They had the stubbornness to refuse defeat even when defeat seemed certain. And sometimes, that was enough to make the impossible possible. The second storm arrived 7 days after the crash. Jake saw it coming long before the others did. He had been watching the sky every morning, reading the cloud patterns like a book. The new storm made the first one look like a gentle rain shower. Wind hit first. It came across the rocky landscape like a freight train, howling and screaming as it found every gap and crack in the terrain. The broken ship began to shake violently. Metal pieces that had been loose before were now torn away completely and sent flying through the air like deadly missiles. Commander Veltar tried to maintain his dignity as water poured through the ship's failing hull. "We can endure this," he said, but his voice shook with doubt. "Zephyrians are strong. We do not surrender to weather." Dr. Kesherin huddled in the corner with her ruined equipment. "Wind speeds are exceeding all previous measurements," she buzzed nervously. "Structural failure of our shelter is imminent." The ship's hull gave a loud groan of protest. One of the main support beams began to bend under the pressure. Cracks spread across the metal walls like spider webs. It was clear that the ship could not survive much more of this punishment. Thane Morgoth stood in the center of the collapsing shelter, his massive form taking up most of the remaining space. "I will not hide in the humans' tiny shelter," he declared. "Warriors do not cower in fear." Ambassador Yilseen floated near the ceiling, her energy form flickering weakly. The constant stress of the harsh environment was draining her power reserves. "Pride is a luxury we can no longer afford," she whispered. Outside, Jake was making final adjustments to his shelter. He had spent the week improving and strengthening his design. The dome was now reinforced with additional support rings. The drainage system had been expanded to handle much larger volumes of water. He had even created a small airlock entrance to better seal out the wind and rain. The shelter looked different now. What had started as a crude emergency construction had evolved into something that resembled advanced engineering. But it was still built entirely from materials found on this hostile world. Massive gust of wind hit the ship and knocked it several feet to one side. The remaining hull cracked completely open, leaving the aliens exposed to the full fury of the storm. Rain poured down on them like a waterfall. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and hypothermia was becoming a real danger. Veltar's pride finally broke. "Human Jake," he called out over the roar of the wind. "We require assistance." Jake appeared at his shelter entrance, completely dry despite the storm raging around him. "Come on," he called back. "There's room for everyone." Dr. Kesherin was the first to move. Her insectoid body was not built for cold weather, and she was beginning to shut down from the temperature drop. She scuttled across the rocky ground and disappeared into Jake's shelter. Ambassador Yilseen followed next. Her energy form was so dim now that she was barely visible. She drifted into the shelter like a dying candle flame. Commander Veltar stood in the rain for a long moment, water running off his scales. His tactical training had not prepared him for this kind of defeat, but survival was more important than pride. He ducked through the shelter entrance. Thane Morgoth was the last to give in. The massive warrior stood in the ruins of the ship as debris flew around him. His thick fur provided some protection from the cold, but even he had limits. When a piece of metal the size of a dinner table flew past his head, missing him by inches, he finally admitted that courage had its boundaries. He lumbered across to Jake's shelter and squeezed through the entrance. Inside, he had to crouch down to fit, but he was amazed by what he found. The shelter was not just dry and warm. It was comfortable. Jake had created sleeping areas for each of them, using soft plant fibers as bedding. There was a small area for food storage and preparation. He had even built a simple ventilation system that kept the air fresh without letting in rain or wind. "This is impossible," Dr. Kesherin said as she examined the interior. "The space appears larger inside than the external dimensions would suggest." Jake was monitoring several stress points on the shelter walls. "It's just good design," he said. "Every cubic foot has a purpose. Nothing is wasted." The storm outside was reaching incredible intensity. Wind speeds were over 200 miles per hour. Hail the size of baseballs pounded against the shelter walls. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and ice was forming on everything exposed to the weather. But inside the shelter, the aliens were warm and safe. The dome shape deflected the wind perfectly. The reinforced structure distributed the load so evenly that no single point was stressed beyond its limits. The insulation created by the woven plant fibers kept their body heat trapped inside. Commander Veltar watched in amazement as the shelter actually became more stable as the storm intensified. The structure is using the storm's energy to strengthen itself, he observed. Jake nodded. The wind pressure pushes down on the dome, which transfers the force into the ground through the support points. The harder the wind blows, the more firmly the shelter anchors itself. Than Morgoth ran his hand along the curved wall. You designed this shelter to become stronger under attack. This is the thinking of a true warrior. I designed it to keep us alive, Jake corrected. Everything else is just engineering. Ambassador Yilsine had recovered some of her energy now that she was out of the harsh conditions. Human Jake, your species continues to surprise us. We underestimated your capabilities. Dr. Kesherin was studying the weaving pattern of the walls. The mathematical complexity hidden in this apparently simple design is remarkable. Each fiber placement serves multiple functions simultaneously. Jake was checking the door seal as rain lashed against it. My grandfather used to say that the best solutions are the ones that look simple but work perfectly. The storm raged outside for 3 more days. During that time, the aliens learned more about human thinking and problem solving than they had discovered in decades of diplomatic contact. Jake shared stories of human history, of civilizations that had survived ice ages and natural disasters. Through determination and ingenuity, your people have faced extinction multiple times, Commander Veltar noted. Yet you survived and grew stronger. That's what we do, Jake said. When something tries to kill us, we figure out how to kill it back. When we can't kill it, we figure out how to live with it. When we can't live with it, we figure out how to get around it. Thane Morgoth laughed, a sound like distant thunder. Your species has the soul of warriors, even if you do not look like fighters. Jake smiled as he adjusted the ventilation system. We're not warriors, we're survivors. Sometimes that's more important. When the second storm finally passed, the aliens emerged from the shelter to find their original refuge completely destroyed. Nothing remained of the ship except scattered pieces of metal and burnt electronics. If they had stayed there, none of them would have survived. But Jake's shelter stood intact, looking like it could withstand a dozen more storms just like the one that had passed. The aliens stood around it in silence, finally understanding what human determination could accomplish when everything seemed hopeless. 2 weeks after the crash, Jake was sitting outside his shelter watching the morning sky when he saw the first rescue ship. It was just a small dot against the clouds at first, but it grew larger as it approached. Soon he could make out the sleek hull and the markings of the Galactic Rescue Service. They found us, he called to the others inside the shelter. The aliens emerged one by one, squinting in the bright sunlight. It had been 3 days since the last storm, and the weather was finally calm. The rescue ship landed about 100 meters away from their camp. Its engines kicked up dust and small rocks as it settled onto the ground. A ramp lowered from the side, and a mixed crew of different alien species walked out. They carried medical scanners and emergency supplies. Captain Zorthik was a tall, blue-skinned being from the Andorian system. He was known throughout the galaxy as one of the best rescue pilots in the service. His team included a Terran medic, a Vulcan engineer, and several other specialists from various worlds. Survivors of the Aurora's dream, Captain Zorthik announced. As he approached, "We have been searching for you for 2 weeks. We are relieved to find you alive." The captain stopped when he saw Jake's shelter. It looked completely out of place on the harsh landscape. The dome structure was clearly built from local materials, but it showed sophisticated engineering principles. Solar collectors made from polished metal focused sunlight to provide heat. A wind-powered ventilation system kept fresh air flowing through the interior. Who constructed this shelter? Captain Zorthik asked, running his scanner over the dome walls. Commander Veltar stepped forward. Human Jake Martinez built it using only materials salvaged from our crashed vessel and resources found on this world. The rescue captain's eyes widened. This entire structure was built without proper tools or construction equipment. Dr. Kesherin nodded enthusiastically. The human completed the basic shelter in 18 hours while working through a severe storm system. He has continued to improve and refine the design over the past 2 weeks. Captain Zorthek walked around the shelter, examining its construction. His engineer, a logical Vulcan named Tren, took detailed scans of the dome structure. She raised one eyebrow in surprise as she read the results. "The structural integrity is remarkable," Tren reported. "The design shows advanced understanding of load distribution, wind dynamics, and thermal regulation. This shelter could withstand conditions far exceeding the safety standards of most permanent structures." The Terran medic, Dr. Sarah Kim, was examining the aliens. All of them were in excellent health despite spending 2 weeks on a hostile world. "No signs of malnutrition, dehydration, or environmental illness," she reported. "Whatever shelter arrangement you had, it worked perfectly." Thane Morgoth gestured toward Jake with respect. "The human saved our lives. When our advanced technology failed, his primitive methods succeeded." Ambassador Yilseen floated closer to Captain Zorthek. Her energy form was bright and stable now, fully recovered from her earlier weakness. "Captain, I must file an official report with the Galactic Council. Human engineering capabilities have been significantly underestimated." Jake was packing his few belongings, getting ready to leave the world that had been home for 2 weeks. He folded up the simple tools he had made from scrap metal. He carefully stored samples of the plant fibers that had proven so useful. Everything else he was leaving behind. "Human Jake," Captain Zorthak said, "my crew would like to study your shelter design. The construction techniques could be valuable for emergency situations throughout the galaxy." Jake shrugged. "It's not complicated. Just basic engineering and a lot of hard work. Anyone could build something like this if they had to." Tren looked up from her detailed scans. "I disagree. The design shows intuitive understanding of multiple complex engineering principles. Most trained engineers would require sophisticated computer modeling to achieve similar results." Dr. Kesherin clicked excitedly. The human performed all calculations mentally while working under extreme stress. He adapted the design in real time as conditions changed. This demonstrates problem-solving abilities that exceed our previous assessments of human intelligence. Commander Veltar stood at attention. As he addressed Captain Zorthak, "I am filing a formal recommendation that humans be considered for inclusion in the Galactic Emergency Response Corps. Their survival capabilities are exceptional." Jake looked surprised. "I just did what needed doing. Anyone would have done the same thing." Thane Morgoth laughed, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. "No, small human. We would not have done the same thing. We would have waited for rescue and likely died in the process. You refuse to accept defeat." Captain Zorthak was taking pictures of the shelter from multiple angles. "This structure will be preserved as a landmark for future expeditions to this world. It demonstrates that survival is possible even under the most challenging conditions." "Ambassador." Yilseen drifted closer to Jake. "The Galactic Council studies many forms of intelligence and capability. We have observed human military strength and human compassion, but we failed to recognize human resilience. This may be your species' greatest gift to the galaxy." Dr. Sarah Kim finished her medical examinations and approached Jake. "As a fellow human, I have to ask, how did you know the shelter would work? Did you have specific training for this kind of situation?" Jake smiled and shouldered his pack. "My grandfather built houses during the Great Depression. He taught me that hope isn't about believing everything will turn out fine. Hope is about believing that whatever happens, you'll figure out how to handle it. The rescue team spent another hour documenting Jake's shelter and interviewing the survivors. Each alien had their own story about human determination and ingenuity. They spoke of Jake's refusal to give up when the situation seemed hopeless. They described his ability to see solutions where others saw only problems. As they prepared to board the rescue ship, Commander Veltar made one final observation. Human. Jake, your species has a saying that we have learned during our time here. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. We understand now what this means. Jake looked back at his shelter one last time. It sat between the rock formations like it had always been there, a perfect blend of human engineering and natural materials. The dome shape caught the sunlight and reflected it back toward the sky. It means we don't quit, Jake said simply. No matter how bad things get, we keep trying, we keep building, we keep hoping. The rescue ship lifted off from Kepler 442b, with all survivors safely aboard. As they climbed through the atmosphere, the aliens looked down at the small dome that had saved their lives. It was already becoming known throughout the galaxy as Martinez Point, a symbol of human determination and the refusal to accept the impossible. Captain Zorthek entered the final log entry for the rescue mission. All survivors recovered in excellent condition. Human engineering capabilities require immediate reassessment. Recommend full study of human survival methodologies for incorporation into standard galactic emergency protocols. Jake sat quietly during the flight home, looking out the window at the stars. He was thinking about his grandfather's old toolbox and all the things you could build when you refused to believe that building them was impossible. Behind them, on the surface of a hostile world, a small dome shelter stood ready to protect the next travelers who might need hope when everything seemed lost.